I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is a still developing idea per se, and I don't know exactly what I want to name it, and the structure of this video will emerge as I talk, and this is one of the few videos that I will do from an extroverted intuitive vantage point. Insofar as that, I could not decide whether or not I wanted to say something about INTJs or INFPs, and the thing that got me thinking about the two types is just the seat of willfulness that exists in the introverted feeling and extroverted thinking axes, and it was in terms of thinking the differences between INTPs, INFPs, and INTJs that embarked me upon sort of these thoughts and some dialogues I've had with people, and so far as type differentiation, and given that there is such a great overlap per se in an individual's existence, and they're falling into or being able to identify with multiple personalities, and not per se any one dominant personality, but factors of intelligence and factors of personal experience, giving them not the strictest and complete binary or black and white existence in one personality category per se, but choosing a personality of best fit insofar as it's an approximation. They approximate themselves as INTJs, they approximate themselves as INFPs, they approximate themselves as INTPs, and I am an individual who knows himself to be, I don't think I can be any other type other than an INTP, because the only other type in my time in looking at typology have I really thought I could identify with was ENTPs, but I found very quickly that I wasn't an ENTP, and I don't identify with the ENTP personality type, though functionally we're the same types, essentially. And it's here in saying that what really struck me was that there is a person I was talking to, and they were saying that they identify as INTJ, but they are also very much INFPs and an INTP. And I think that this happens by way of a misunderstanding of the cognitive functions, insofar as what the cognitive functions that are popularly discussed in the MBTI community, if not for Leon of Type Tips and his indulgence in the shadow functions, are the conscious functions and the dominant or valued functions. And it is a misunderstanding that the human psyche is not, that one's cognitive arrangement and their psyche is not merely the collection of their valued functions, but each individual, because they are factors of human cognition, which are by way of emergent structures from nature and evolutionary processes, everyone has each cognitive function. There are different strengths and expressions of magnitude in one's psyche of each cognitive function, but everyone is all all the types in some way, essentially. Even though I do not necessarily relate to INFPs being an INTP, I have a great romantic attraction and even sexual desire towards them because they are the most repressed part of my consciousness. At least I think that's how Jung would postulate it. And it's to say that when I was talking to this individual, they voiced that they were an INTJ, but they thought that they were also just as much an INTP in certain ways, as they resonate and appreciate introverted thinking. And it's to say that INTJs have polar introverted thinking, just as I, as an INTP, being a secondary extroverted intuitive type, has polar introverted intuition. The polar functions are the next strongest functions within our psyche. They're just the most powerful, unconscious parts of our psyche, and essentially the pool that we swim through in our psychic energy. If we were fish, they would be the sea that we exist in, or the water that surrounds us. That's how Leonov type tips analogizes it, and it's to say that it's the surrounding psychic energy to all else, and the water that surrounds the vessel that is ourself, because there's a depth to human existence insofar as there's a depth to our psyche, as we're not completely our egos or what we actively identify with, but are a fundamental amalgamation of things, which is a human being, which is an amalgamation of competing biological drives that tend to head towards the same direction. That's a definition I've used often before. So it is true that people will identify with aspects of other types, and may strongly identify with aspects of other types, but I don't find, at least I don't think, that even though biology is something that is rather chaotic and nature is something that is a self-organizing system, insofar as there is many emergent properties in it, and not so fixed things, but things of patternistic elements to it, insofar as it tends to behave a certain way. It has behavioral tendencies, but laws of nature, such as the physical laws, are descriptions rather than being actual immutable eternal things in the way that were once considered and thought in the deistic, insofar as the deism that was in Newton, and the monotheistic vantage point that was embedded in classical mechanics and things. It's just that nature doesn't work like that, and the human psyche may not work like that, but I think that temperament is the basis for personality, and temperament is something that is fairly fixed and not something that changes per se, and is mostly one's genetic makeup. And because there's not a lot of things and a lot of factors that lead to one's temperamental structures, insofar as it's not a great deal of neurochemicals that go into the process of shaping somebody's temperament, and there's not a great deal of variation in human brains, I do still believe and think that people do have the 16 personality formations within their mind, and somebody's neurophrenology, whether they identify with other stronger psychic elements and other personality types, is a type specifically, because the temperament that the person was born with, it's something that was determined and something that was limited per se in its makeup, and something that only a few things came together to make per se, and there's not a great deal of variety in the temperamental packages that people come with, insofar as that people vary in their dimensions of being agreeable, neurotic, aggressive, exploratory, novelty or thrill-seeking, certain factors that are just universal in human tendencies from culture to culture are shaped and constructed in the individual's prenatal development, and they're inflected and influenced by the environment, of course, insofar as that your personality emerges forth from that, but it's really one's temperament that I look at being the material explanation for an archetypal self, and the thing that tells me that there is, even though people do have this idea of best guess and model of best fit, there is some personality category that you fit in with that at a certain fundamental level the lines don't blur as much as one would consider. And it's why I started thinking about INFPs, INTPs, and INTJs. And the first thing that I separate from the two is the willfulness that, from the three, is that the willfulness that exists in the other that doesn't exist in the one. The willfulness that exists in INFPs and INTJs is not in INTPs. It's why I joke sometimes about saying I don't have a soul, but I don't have a will all the time. And it's what leads to sometimes what people will call laziness in an INTP. And it's just, I'm not so insistent on my desires and watching my desires manifest themselves and propagate in the environment. I'm a human being, so there is a necessary response in dopamine, or a reward in dopamine that I receive from approaching a goal. But I do not, and I am not driven to be as willful as the INFP and the INTJ. They derive things and they start things from their own will, where I may want something and I may want to think something, but I will give that up and I will sacrifice that, or I will capitulate myself over, or even abrogate my desires, or prostrate myself under what I think is the truth. It's not to say that INTJs and INFPs will not revise their thoughts insofar as if they value truth or if they value empiricism. It's not to say that they won't do that, but the reason for their actions and the motivations for their actions is their will. Nothing else arises out of them aside of their will, their desires and their wants. The TEFI axis is fundamentally different from the TIFE axis. It is not that they won't exist, that because within an INTJ they are subconsciously organizing and making an internal system of logic, and the introverted intuitive insights they're coming up with, they are arranging these things and rendering them in some respects, but they're not doing that. They're organizing their psyche and they're organizing their thoughts, but they're doing that per se because they want something. they want something as a person, as an individual, and as an existence. They have the need to be to be willful and have a passionate existence. I'm intense as an individual, and I can be passionate about abstractions, but I'm not at all the same type of willful creature that the INFP or the INTJ are, and it's by way of the introverted feeling and extroverted thinking axes that my psyche does not drift towards there, and I don't do it very often. And I will give up my way a lot of times to maintain peace, or a lot of times to, for whatever reason, it may be just not, I don't analyze or assess the situation as worth being insistent, but that's not something that is in the INFP or the INTJ, and it's something that I notice in both INFPs and INTJs, is that they are the Judeo-Christian God in a lot of ways. They are Yahweh, and Yahweh would be the personification or the Gnostic expression or spiritual or numinous expression, whatever you would like to call it or consider it, of the TEFI axes. All that he does, and it's said in the Old Testament, all that he does is to his pleasure, his glory, and by way of his will. All of it is done for his pleasure, his glory, and by way of his will. It's not to say that INFPs and INTJs are necessarily narcissistic or anything like that, or that they're overly selfish or anything like that, though prominent INTJs such as Ayn Rand had the virtue of selfishness, but it wasn't selfishness in any narcissistic way or dark triad manner that's so popularly talked about in popular psychology nowadays, but it was the fact that one's will and one's volition matters and dominates the scope of one's actions and the ethical position one takes. And this should all be, and I'm describing the virtue of selfishness, the ethical position that one takes, and this should all be subjugated to rationality, but it is one's will, volition, and actions, and such as Aristotle said, that we are what we do. It is by way of acting and being that makes us. By will or by volition, that's what makes us, and that is at the heart and at the center of an INTJ or an INFP. They are ethics to some extent, and I've said this because it's partly by way of introverted feeling. They are the seat of morality, and they are engineers of what it means to be human. They make it up. They create it, and they make it up, and they're concerned with it. And that's at the heart of an INTJ, and that's at the top of an INFP. And it is what essentially is their honor, their glory, their majesty, their power, their will, their expression, forever and ever. Amen. That's what it is. They're at the end, in their psyche, in who they are, no matter what else they identify with, there is a collection of values that they, there's a system of values that they have constructed, and they constructed these systems of values and created themselves in accordance with their experience and their pleasure, their wants, not in a hedonistic sense or an Epicurean sense of the word, but insofar as that they believe that they are agents. That's the best way I can say it. You would not have been able to convince Aristotle that there was no self. I don't think you'll ever be able to convince an INTJ really that there is no self, or an INFP. Try telling that to them, because that's not what's at the core of the introverted feeling and extroverted thinking axes. It is what's different amongst us, and how I am shaped in expressing myself in the world that, excuse me, has the greatest determining factor in what I am or who I am. And you get the statement, I am who I am, by way of introverted feeling and extroverted thinking. And I think that when you look at INTJs like Jean-Paul Sartre, he had a very real ethic of responsibility within his existential writings, and he had that one creates themselves, and he had that one has the responsibility that they have, because their actions essentially tell another human being or another person who it is they can be and what constitutes what it means to be human. Essentially, that even in the INTJ, there is this aspect of the creation of self. There is fundamentally this thing of will. And I think it's why Friedrich Nietzsche said that what underlies all things in nature is simply will, and one will at that, and it's the will to power. And the will to power is not one merely of subjugation, but one of the individual's drive to exert themselves in the environment, on the environment, and grow and be enwrapped in a fervor and Dionysian experience in some respects. Nietzsche was an interesting philosopher, but it is there again that this idea of will, it's so prominent in their actions and their makeup, and it's the same with the ENTJ. Just this incredible willfulness in them, because they have this thing that is the self, and the self is essentially everything you would find in the Old Testament about the Old Testament God in many ways. And I think that's why you get Gnostics saying crazy things like people are gods fundamentally, and that there's a God inside of you and things like that. I've said what I think about Gnosticism, and I'm a materialist. For me, it's completely a metaphor, but some people will take this as a very literal something. But for me, it's completely a metaphor and an illustrative tool. But the fact that they breathe their existence into what they do. They make the world over in their image. And when I say they, I mean INFPs, I mean ENTJs, I mean INTJs and ENFPs. They do this. That nothing will stay the same in a sense. Their majesty and their glory will be poured out on the world, and it will change it, or it will be poured out on a thing, and it will change it, and it will forever be, their image or their thumbprint will forever be imprinted on it. because they cannot not leave their self around in the world, because they are essentially, that is all that they are, is a will and a self. It's in the INTJ, it's in the ENTJ, it's in the ENFP. And that's why when I was talking to this person, I could not understand is just because you appreciate deductive reasoning and logical systems, or just because you appreciate collectivism or sociality and the greater good, or just because you appreciate these things, or you're able to act in some manner, or do things, or identify with something, there is something deeper at the core, and is your motivational structures and your temperamental patterns that are fundamentally different from one who is that type or that thing that you readily identify with. It's why I don't like behaviorism per se when it comes to typology, or keeping the talk of IQ and intelligence out of the picture when it comes to typology also, or evolutionary biology, because there is inflections that are in each individual, and I think that one's intelligence influences their personality, and I think that there is the ability for a person to adapt and to grow and to have, by way of their personal experiences, or how they were raised, or their early childhood experiences, to have idiosyncratic inflections and to tend towards this direction a little more, or tend towards that direction, and you get variations in the typological schema that makes up a person. But at the core of them, they are their biology, and they are the ideal self, or they are the archetype, and that thing, when you look from type to type, whether it is an INFP, whether it is an INTP, an INTJ, an ESFP, an ESFJ, whatever would have you, there is something fundamental I'm realizing, even when types are similar, so similar, such as INTPs and ENTPs, there is something that is fundamentally different, because by way of their motivational schema, what their existence leads them to do, and what their existence leads them to be. It's not even necessarily what you will do, but what you will consider, and how you will consider it, the vein and the thought process that will go behind what you're considering, why you even adapt, what philosophical models stand out to you, for what reason you may even adopt a philosophical model. Because there's things that Nietzsche says that I agree with. There's many things that Nietzsche says that I don't agree with. But there's things that he does say that I do agree with. But I don't accept the things that Nietzsche says and agree with them from an extroverted thinking standpoint, an extroverted and introverted feeling standpoint, but from an introverted thinking and extroverted feeling standpoint about what's true for all times, and not really what I want, or volition or will, or essentially achieving any aim or means by way of what I think is necessary by way of my existence. It's not to say that and I'm talking about a very broad idea and using types as illustrations to talk about this idea insofar as differentiating ourselves from the variances the idiosyncratic variances that exist in us. But it's just that I'm not saying in the INTJ or the I'll just say the INTJ, it's not that they necessarily want to dominate any one person or anything, but they nothing that they consider, whether they're aware of it or not. Same thing with an INFP or an ENFP or an ENTJ. Nothing they will consider will be outside of their will, their desires, and their wants. They cannot get away from it, and they won't get away from it because they're powerful and prominent, strong pieces of their psyche. And I think that one may identify with certain things, but we are not all in all. And nature does have a way of making us with a very random, chaotic pattern of ordering. But at the same time, people get here by way of sexual selection. There's not a lot of variation per se in the human genome that one should be led to believe that even if they are individuals, that they are so fundamentally different per se. I think that when people are looking at the popular literature that exists in the typological landscape, then you can read those type descriptions and say, hey, that's me, hey, that's me, to some extent. But I think when one gets to the core of what a type is, and I mean the core of what a type is, as in what is their mode of existence, what does it mean to be this, what is a INTJ or an INTP, as if they were creatures of some extent. It's just that I think that there is a mode of being, a thing that a person is that constitutes their existence, that will pervade, influence, and inflect on everything that they do, and create the matrix that they live in, and they never really will get out of it, even to their chagrin or greatest ability. The ego is not the end of the person, and the ego may not exist to some extent, but Alan Watts, a very prominent philosopher and metaphysical thinker, said this, insofar as, and I can see where he's going, is that everything is a game of one-upmanship for most people, and it's that the Buddhist disavows the ego to get to the higher self, to be able to better police himself and mitigate the rascality. Everybody has a little bit of rascal in them. The rascality, or the shadow sides of them, or the desires and illusions within them, and they will do this they will get to the higher self and will reach enlightenment, but have they left the physical world, and have they stopped being human, essentially? And his point was no, and that you never get away from yourself. You won't do it, especially not if you attempt to do it. Attempting to do so is probably harder, and you just be. But you are who you are, and you are what you are. And there's something fundamental to who you are and what you are. And they're core things that affiliate and group certain types together. And there are things that differentiate other types. It's interesting when I interact with other NTs, ENTPs, INTJs, and ENTJs, because we are very similar insofar as that we're intuitive thinking types, but we are so very fundamentally different. And that TIFE and TEFI, they're not, we're different. We are very, very much different. And the prominence of the glorification of the self, not in any negative manner, but just the consistent tenet of that being the consistent phenomenon of that being a central tenet, and introverted feeling, extroverted thinking types, just the ubiquity of it leads me to say that you may identify with certain things in other types, but there's something about you that's very much different from all the other types, insofar as you're a will, you're a walking and a living will, and that's not necessarily something that's true of me and other types. So that's the video, and again, I don't really know what the name of this video is. It's just I've been having so many conversations about differentiating and how types do differ from one another, whether they've been online or with friends, and I don't know. I just thought it was something I should share. So I suppose I'll call this thoughts on the FITE axes and type differentiation. So thank you for watching. Hopefully you found the video interesting.